am never ashamed of being Pablo Escobar's mother." Those words echoed as Hermilda Gaviria tightly clutched her deceased son's shirts beneath her pillow. The world saw a monster. She saw her child. But behind that facade of unbreakable maternal love, there was another story. A story where ambition, power, and manipulation were woven together with motherhood. A woman who shaped the mind of one of the most notorious criminals in history, while maintaining a public image as a devoted schoolteacher and a loving mother. The true Hermilda Gaviria remains an enigma wrapped in contradictions. Was she simply a mother blinded by love, or the calculating architect behind her son's empire? The answer is far more disturbing than we might imagine. In rural Colombia in the mid-20th century, a school teacher with extraordinary ambitions gave birth to a boy who would forever change the global criminal landscape. Hermilda Gaviria was not an ordinary woman. Described by biographers as educated and exceptionally capable, she possessed an intelligence and determination uncommon for a woman of her time and environment. While she publicly dedicated herself to the noble profession of teaching children in the rural areas of Antioquia, in private she instilled very different values in her second son, Pablo. What makes Hermilda's case so fascinating is the duality she maintained throughout her life. On one hand, the public image of a devout Catholic, especially devoted to Our Lady of Fatima and the child Jesus of Atocha. On the other, the woman who, according to testimonies, not only tolerated but possibly encouraged her son's criminal activities, benefiting enormously from them. How can these two versions of the same person be reconciled? Was Hermilda a victim of impossible circumstances, or a master manipulator who used her own son as a vehicle for her ambitions? The answer seems to change depending on who tells the story. What we know for certain is that Hermilda exercised an extraordinary influence over Pablo Escobar. Unlike many criminals who distanced themselves from their families, Pablo maintained an almost religious devotion to his mother throughout his life. Even at the height of his power, when he controlled a criminal empire valued in the billions, he continued to seek his mother's approval. But there is a deeper mystery in this relationship. After Pablo was taken out on that Medellin rooftop in 1993, unsettling stories began to emerge. Rumors of family betrayals, secret alliances with Pablo's enemies, and a mother who may have valued properties and money more than the memory of her fallen son. These accusations, some coming from Pablo's own son Juan Pablo Escobar, raised disturbing questions. How far was Hermilda willing to go to maintain the lifestyle her son's activities had provided? And what really happened at that mysterious meeting in Cali where she allegedly sat alongside her son's mortal enemies? The story of Hermilda Gaviria is not simply the story of a criminal's mother. It is a study of the power of maternal influence, moral ambiguity, and the human capacity for self-deception. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it is a reminder that monsters are not born, they are created. Hermilda Gaviria Berrio was born on April 9, 1927 in El Tablazo, a small town in Antioquia, Colombia. Her childhood unfolded in an environment of material scarcity but strong family values. However, according to several accounts, her father occasionally resorted to illegal activities to supplement the family income, an early lesson that would not go unnoticed by young Hermilda. Sometimes rules could be bent if the outcome justified the means. Despite economic limitations, Hermilda managed to educate herself and eventually became a rural school teacher, a respected profession that granted her a certain status within her community. On March 4, 1946, she married Abel de Jesus Escobar Echeverri, a hard-working man who owned some land and livestock. Together they formed a large family, having 7 children between 1947 and 1958, with Pablo being the second. Colombia at the time was marked by deep social inequalities and an exclusionary political system. The period known as La Violencia, (1948 to 1958), left approximately 200,000 people dead in a deeply fractured society. In this context of instability and limited opportunities, Hermilda instilled in her children, especially Pablo, a fierce ambition and the idea that the end justified the means. Neighbors of the Escobar Gaviria family in the Envigado area of Medellin remember Hermilda as a strict yet affectionate mother. However, they also recall her constant dissatisfaction with her economic situation. She always wanted more for her family, one former neighbor remembers. She wasn't content like other women of the time. This ambition manifested in frequent comments about the importance of money and social status. Pablo, particularly receptive to these messages, began at a young age to look for ways to climb economically. His early offenses, minor thefts and scams, were known to his mother who, according to testimonies, never firmly condemned them. As Pablo rose within the criminal world, moving from small thefts to smuggling and eventually to the trafficking of controlled substances, Hermilda's attitude toward her son's activities became revealing. Far from showing concern or trying to redirect him toward a legal path, she seemed to tacitly accept his business as long as it provided material benefits to the family. By the late 1970s, when Pablo had already established himself as a major distributor of illegal substances, Hermilda was living in a luxurious home, wearing expensive clothes and enjoying privileges she could never have afforded on a teacher's salary. Yet she carefully maintained her public image as a hard-working and devout woman. This duality became Hermilda's defining trait, the ability to maintain a facade of respectability while benefiting from activities she knew were criminal. As an agent who later investigated the Medellin organization would comment, Doña Hermilda knew exactly where every peso she spent came from. She wasn't naive. She was possibly the most informed person about her son's operations, second only to Pablo himself. As Pablo Escobar's criminal empire grew exponentially throughout the 1980s, Hermilda Gaviria's role in his life became increasingly complex. She was not simply the mother of the man who would become the most wanted criminal in the world. She was his confidant, his advisor, and according to some, his distorted moral compass. The early years of the decade marked Pablo's meteoric rise. His criminal organization evolved from a regional group into a transnational empire that controlled approximately 80% of the illegal substance market bound for the United States. With this explosive growth, Pablo's income reached astronomical figures, estimated at around $30 million a day at its peak. And Hermilda was there, watching her son accumulate an unimaginable fortune. Doña Hermilda never questioned where the money came from, recalls a former employee of Hacienda Nápoles, Pablo's extravagant estate. On the contrary, she seemed proud of her son's success. She always said Pablo was a brilliant businessman, as if he were selling coffee or flowers, not illegal substances. This apparent selective blindness is especially disturbing when one considers that Hermilda was not an uninformed or naive woman. As an educated teacher with widely recognized intelligence, she could hardly ignore the true nature of her son's activities, especially when those activities began to turn Colombia's streets violently chaotic. Between 1984 and 1991, the conflict between the Medellin organization and the Colombian state, along with rivalries with other criminal groups, left thousands of people dead. Judges, journalists, politicians, and ordinary citizens had their lives taken on Pablo's orders or as collateral damage in his wars. Yet in every public interview, Hermilda defended her son unconditionally, describing him as misunderstood and a benefactor of the people. This defense was not merely rhetorical. Hermilda actively participated in social projects financed with money from the trafficking of substances, such as the construction of the Pablo Escobar neighborhood, where 500 homes were built for the unhoused. These actions allowed her to maintain the narrative that her son was a Colombian Robin Hood, conveniently ignoring the origin of those funds and the trail of violence they left behind. Hermilda's influence over Pablo went beyond a simple mother-son relationship. According to several testimonies, including that of Carlos Later, another notorious trafficker, Pablo frequently consulted his mother on major decisions. Doña Hermilda's opinion carried more weight than that of any lieutenant, Later stated in an interview after his capture. This influence manifested in surprising ways. For example, when Pablo decided to turn himself into the authorities in 1991, under the terms of the government's justice submission policy, Hermilda was one of the few people consulted before the final decision was made. During his stay in the luxury prison known as La Catedral, Hermilda visited him regularly, bringing homemade food and, according to rumors, messages from the outside world. However, the relationship between mother and son had darker undertones that are rarely discussed openly. Juan Pablo Escobar, Pablo's son, suggests in his book, Pablo Escobar, My Father, that Hermilda exercised an almost manipulative influence over his father. My grandmother knew exactly how to handle my father, he wrote. When she wanted something, she knew which emotional buttons to press. This dynamic became especially evident in moments of crisis. When pressure on Pablo intensified, Hermilda frequently appealed to her role as the suffering mother, reminding him of his family responsibilities and how his actions affected the extended family. This type of emotional manipulation proved extremely effective with Pablo, who was known for his deep family devotion. As the net closed in around Pablo after his escape from La Catedral in 1992, Hermilda's behavior began to show revealing cracks. While she continued to fiercely defend her son in public and private, according to some testimonies, she began establishing contacts with figures who could secure her own future, regardless of Pablo's fate. One particularly revealing incident occurred in October 1993, just 2 months before Pablo was taken out. According to a former member of the search bloc, the special unit created to capture Escobar, Hermilda was seen meeting with an intermediary linked to Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, the paramilitary group funded by the Cali organization and former associates of Pablo who sought his elimination. The meeting lasted about an hour, the source stated under condition of anonymity. We don't know exactly what was discussed, but after that encounter we noticed changes in Escobar's movement patterns, as if someone close to him was advising him to alter his routines. This testimony, while not conclusive, casts a troubling shadow over Hermilda's loyalty to her son during his final days. Was she simply a desperate mother seeking a way out for her son? Or was she securing her own future in the face of Pablo's imminent fall? The answer may lie in what happened after Pablo was taken out on December 2, 1993. While her son's body was barely cold, Hermilda was already negotiating with Pablo's former enemies. According to Juan Pablo Escobar, his grandmother actively participated in meetings with members of the Cali organization to discuss the distribution of the assets Pablo had left behind. My grandmother insisted that all the properties my father had left for us should be handed over to her, Juan Pablo wrote. It was as if my father's legacy was simply loot to be divided, not the future he had planned for his children. This apparent final betrayal raises the most disturbing question of all about Hermilda Gaviria. Was her love for Pablo conditional on the material benefits he provided? Or was she a pragmatic woman who, faced with her son's inevitable downfall, simply did what she believed was necessary to protect the rest of the family? Hermilda Gaviria's complexity lies precisely in this moral ambiguity. She was neither simply a loving mother blinded by affection, as she wished to portray herself, nor a cold manipulator who used her son purely as a tool for ambition. Like all human beings, she was a contradictory combination of both extremes, navigating extraordinary circumstances with a compromised moral compass. What is clear is that without Hermilda, Pablo Escobar likely would never have become who he was. She did not only give him life biologically, she shaped his worldview, his values, and crucially, his moral justification for his actions. In that sense, Hermilda Gaviria's true legacy is not the interviews defending her son or the social projects she promoted, but the monster she helped create, one that left a country immersed in extreme violence. To truly understand Hermilda Gaviria, we must examine the psychological patterns that defined her relationship with Pablo and her response to her son's criminal activities. Family psychology experts point out that her behavior exhibits classic characteristics of what is known as selective maternal denial, a defense mechanism in which a mother consciously ignores evidence that contradicts the idealized image she has of her child. What we see in Hermilda is an extreme case of cognitive dissonance, explains Dr. Maria Fernandez, a psychologist specializing in criminal family dynamics. On one hand, it was impossible for her not to know the true nature of Pablo's activities. On the other, accepting that reality would have destroyed not only her image of her son, but her own identity as a mother. This selective denial manifested in public statements where Hermilda insisted on Pablo's innocence or minimized his crimes, while simultaneously enjoying the material benefits those same crimes provided. "I never believed he was a criminal, and I still don't," she declared in an interview while living in a mansion purchased with money from illegal trafficking operations. Even more revealing is the parenting pattern Hermilda established with Pablo from his childhood. According to testimonies from relatives and neighbors, Hermilda always showed a marked preference for Pablo over her other children. This favorite child dynamic created a symbiotic relationship in which Pablo constantly sought maternal approval, and Hermilda used that desire to influence him. "Pablo would do anything to please his mother," recalls a former childhood friend. "If she mentioned that she liked something, a week later, Pablo would get it for her no matter how." This dynamic evolved into a form of delegated narcissism, where Hermilda lived vicariously through her son's achievements. Every new mansion, every expansion of the criminal empire, every display of Pablo's power was indirectly a form of validation for her. Particularly revealing is the way Hermilda morally justified Pablo's actions. On multiple occasions, she framed her son's criminal activities as a form of social justice, pointing to the charitable works he carried out in poor neighborhoods. "Pablo helps those the government has forgotten," was a recurring phrase in her statements. This moral reinterpretation allowed Hermilda to maintain a positive self-image while benefiting from activities she knew were destructive. Psychologists refer to this as moral neutralization, a process through which individuals justify behaviors they would otherwise consider immoral. Hermilda's behavior after Pablo's death reveals yet another layer of her complex psychology. Her rapid rapprochement with her son's enemies suggests a cold pragmatism that contrasts sharply with the image of the devoted mother she projected publicly. At the critical moment, when she had to choose between honoring her son's memory or securing her own material well-being, she chose the latter, observes Dr. Carlos Ramirez, an expert in criminal profiling. This apparent contradiction between her words and actions suggests that Hermilda may have displayed manipulative personality traits. Her ability to maintain a public image of a loving, devoted mother while potentially betraying her deceased son's wishes indicates a remarkable capacity for psychological compartmentalization. Ultimately, Hermilda Gaviria represents a fascinating case study of how extreme circumstances can distort even the supposedly purest bond. Maternal love. Her legacy is not simply that of Pablo Escobar's mother, but an example of how ambition, denial, and moral justification can transform an apparently ordinary person into an accomplice to unimaginable atrocities. On the morning of December 2nd, 1993, while Pablo Escobar's lifeless body lay on a Medellin rooftop, Hermilda Gaviria received the news that would change her life forever. Her son, the most wanted man in the world, had finally been taken out by the authorities. Cameras captured her devastated face, a mother submerged in the deepest grief. Her eyes, reddened from crying, seemed to hold all of Colombia's tragedy. To the world, it was the perfect image of maternal suffering. However, what happened in the hours and days that followed would reveal a side of Hermilda few had ever seen. As the cameras pulled away and the media circus faded, a silent battle began over the empire Pablo had left behind. A fortune estimated in the billions of dollars, properties scattered across the country, secret bank accounts, and perhaps most valuable of all, the contacts and routes that had made Pablo the king of illegal substances. Juan Pablo Escobar, then a 16-year-old teenager, was in shock over the loss of his father when he was summoned to a meeting that would mark a turning point in his life. The place, a mansion in Cali. The hosts, the leaders of the Cali organization, the very men who had financed Los Pepes, the paramilitary group created specifically to take out his father. When I arrived at that house, what I saw first left me frozen, he would later recall in his book. My grandmother Hermilda was sitting next to them as if they were old friends. My uncles, my father's brothers, were also there. Everyone seemed comfortable, as if they weren't sitting with the same people who had contributed to Pablo's death. The meeting, according to Juan Pablo, had a clear purpose: renegotiating the future of the Escobar empire. The Cali leaders wanted the roots and international contacts. Pablo's brothers and Hermilda wanted security guarantees and a share of the assets. Juan Pablo and his mother, Victoria Eugenia Henao, simply wanted to survive and access what Pablo had legitimately left for them. My grandmother spoke up, Juan Pablo continues. With a coldness I had never seen in her, she began arguing that all the properties and accounts should come under her control. She said that as Pablo's mother, she was the most suitable person to manage his legacy. This moment represents the culmination of decades of moral ambiguity in Hermilda's life. The woman who had publicly defended her son as a misunderstood saint was now negotiating with his enemies while his body was barely cold. The mother who supposedly loved Pablo unconditionally now appeared more concerned with properties and money than with honoring his wishes for his children's future. The betrayal, if we can call it that, did not end with that meeting. In the months that followed, Hermilda actively participated in the dismantling of her son's empire. Properties Pablo had specifically designated for Juan Pablo and his sister were sold or transferred. Bank accounts were emptied. The deceased man's will was systematically ignored. The most painful thing wasn't losing the money or the properties, Juan Pablo would reflect years later. It was realizing that the image I had of my grandmother was completely false. The woman I believed loved my father above all else actually saw him as a means to obtain wealth and status. This revelation raises unsettling questions about Hermilda's entire life. Had she always been this way, manipulating Pablo for her own ends? Or did the extreme pressure of the circumstances reveal a hidden side of her personality? Testimonies from former members of the Medellin organization suggest that Hermilda always had a disproportionate influence over Pablo's decisions, especially those related to money and property. Pablo consulted everything with his mother, recalls a former cartel accountant. From buying a new estate to gifts for his wife, nothing was done without Doña Hermilda's approval. This influence even extended to operational decisions within the organization. According to several accounts, Hermilda occasionally expressed opinions about who was trustworthy and who was not within the group. These opinions, seemingly based on maternal intuition, often resulted in personnel changes that sometimes had fatal consequences for those singled out. The image that emerges is that of a woman who, far from being a passive victim of circumstances or a naive mother, was an active participant in the construction and eventual dismantling of her son's criminal empire. a woman who used her unique position as a mother to influence, manipulate, and ultimately benefit personally. Hermilda Gaviria's true legacy is not simply being the mother of the most famous trafficker in history, but possibly being the mind that shaped him, the advisor who guided him, and in his final moments, the figure who may have contributed to his downfall. A woman who embodied, like few others, the duality between a loving mother and a calculating manipulator. Hermilda Gaviria passed away on November 15, 2006, taking to the grave the darkest secrets of her relationship with Pablo Escobar. Until her final breath, she maintained the narrative of being nothing more than a devoted mother who loved her misunderstood son unconditionally. "I sleep with his shirts under my pillow," she said in one of her last interviews, perpetuating the image of the grieving mother she had carefully cultivated. The truth, as often happens with complex historical figures, likely lies somewhere between the extremes. Hermilda was neither simply a saintly mother nor a calculating monster. She was a human being caught in extraordinary circumstances, navigating a world of extreme violence and illicit wealth with a compromised moral compass. Her true legacy is a warning about the power of maternal influence and how the values we instill in our children can have consequences that echo across generations. Pablo Escobar was not born a criminal. He was shaped by his environment, his circumstances, and crucially by the values his mother passed on to him. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Hermilda Gaviria's story is that monsters rarely see themselves as such. In her mind, until the very end, she was simply a mother who loved her son. And that capacity for self-deception, for moral justification in the face of the indefensible, is possibly the most terrifying aspect of her legacy.